And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics. Pleasure to be here at Freedom Fest 2018, and we are sitting with the President of Americans for Tax Reform. Nice to have you back with us, Grover Norquist.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, pleasure. So first of all, my first question for you was, how was Burning Man 2018? Biggest question of the year, I'm sure.
Burning Man 2018
Is that not happened yet?
Last August, last Monday of August.
Oh, okay.
So it's always last Monday of August to the first Monday of September.
It's the important thing.
Yes, that's coming up. It's coming up.
Right. Okay.
It's going to be great.
You know, you are going to be our voice on the ground. You know, for me as an almost 50-year-old, I'm going to have to just kind of, you know, allow you to have the professionalism and the expertise to give us exactly what we need while I'm not there.
Okay.
It's just too dirty for me.
Burning Man? It's dusty. It's not dirty, it's dusty.
Dirty and dusty? Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. You brought your daughter there last year, right?
I am in the midst of negotiating that with my wife. 2 daughters. And my wife correctly says the youngest one will go, "What is all this dust?" And the older one will go, "These are my people, I'm not going home." So those are the two approaches.
It's the epitome of, I don't know if it's a socialism or communism of some type, but it's the epitome of a very left of center economic model, isn't it?
No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite.
How so?
Everybody's there on their own.
Okay.
Now, there's no buying and selling stuff there, so you bring everything. It's complete. You bring everything that you need. You can actually buy ice and coffee. Those are the 2 things you can buy at Burning Man. Otherwise, you bring your food, you bring your drink, you bring your toilet facilities, and you are in charge of yourself. It is radical individualism with radical communitarianism in the sense that you're there with 70,000 other people, you're going through the same thing. You work together in small groups, people set up camps, they divvy up cooking and food and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So it's voluntary. It's all
So it's like a sharing society in many ways?
People say that. What that is, it's a gifting society. People give gifts to each other, little gifts.
Okay.
I thought you were bringing stuff to trade because people kept saying, you know, they do this, they don't buy stuff, they barter. No, they don't. That's not what happens. So I brought Cuban cigars, which I thought was sufficiently edgy and illegal to be worth doing, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it'd be interesting to see how that could actually relate to our current economy, because we've got some things happening right now. We spoke earlier this spring, and as things have moved forward, the protectionism, the tariffs, the trade wars that are happening right now, interesting event that's just happened in the past week or so. China's actually seems like, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, they seem to be kind of ready to come to the table on trade talks. Is that correct?
They have been for some time, and I don't quite understand why the president didn't take the deals that have been in. Maybe he thinks they get better. The problem is you get people invested in the pain they've already absorbed, and their willingness to change doesn't necessarily go up. I worry about trade wars. I understand the president's argument that we have some trade deals where the Chinese either cheat or never agreed to anything in the first place, and we need to do better. The Europeans have tariffs on us that we don't put on them. I'm not in favor of putting tariffs on them, because tariffs put up by your own country are actually taxes on your citizens. You only do damage to your own country when you put up tariffs. So they're always a bad idea. That said, I understand the argument that we should have more free and open trade. The president thinks he can get there with threats of tariffs. I think that's a little bit like deciding to do an appendectomy with a baseball bat. There's just going to be an awful lot of blood on the floor, and I'm not sure the appendix is the only thing coming out when you take that approach. Step back though for a second. As much as I think that tariffs are trade wars are a war of choice, like Iraq, which the president gets was a mistake, and that they're unhelpful. If we back up and say what's going on, how come the stock market hasn't collapsed with threats of trade wars? Because of all the very, very helpful, positive things that have gone on in the last year and a half. We took the tax rates on businesses from 35%, highest in the world, to 21%. We used to be at 35 when China, the socialists, were at 25, when Germany was at 25, when the European average is around 25, and we were 10 points behind everybody else. I mean, that's a real handicap to put yourself in on international trade and competitiveness. We took that down to 21. We cut taxes for every single American taxpayer. We cut tax rates for every single American. We cut actual tax burden for 90+% of American taxpayers. Pretty impressive stuff. Very, very helpful. There's $2 trillion of American assets overseas that didn't come back because we had penalties if you brought the money back, as stupid as that sounds. We ended that, and what you now have is that money can come, $2 trillion can come back tax-free. So over $300 billion came back in the first 3 months of this year. They think at least 700 billion comes back this year, another 700 billion next year. It's very, very impressive stuff. And you add that to the deregulation movement. That's why the stock market's gone up. That's why we went from 2% growth to 3% growth for the last year. And perhaps 4% in the last 3 months. It's looking good. There's a little bit of a queasiness because of tariffs.
Okay, so the queasiness, put that to the side. Do you see, I mean, just as a side note question to that, because I want to get into the broader economy here, are you concerned about any black swan events right now? Is there anything on the horizon for you that you're concerned about? Any other sovereignty situations, fiscal issues? We see China slowing down, possibly, maybe even Germany, some of the EU. With Brexit, it's happening, kind of sort of not happening. I don't know what that is now.
Yeah, I don't think that any of those are particularly problematic for us. China slowing its growth just means that they'll have to keep wanting to sell us stuff.
Right.
The technology and our innovation in getting energy out of the ground, natural gas and oil, keeps increasing. Our energy dominance, as they like to talk about it, is strengthening. We're now an exporter. We make more oil now or next week compared to Russia, and that's 40% of their economy.
Right.
If you want to do damage to Russia, pump more natural gas and oil here and drop the price compared to what it would be otherwise. It's the only thing they've got to sell, that and some arms. So I think it's been very helpful. We can write out just about anything. What we need to do is to do entitlement reform so that we take down the $90 trillion in unfunded liabilities that came from all of our entitlement programs, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare, Obamacare. On the side, the president set aside Medicare and Social Security. But all of the other stuff, he says he would like to reform and take that cost curve and bend it down, block grant it to the states and say it can't grow faster than inflation.
You've been around for decades. You were, I mean, Ronald Reagan days, okay? 40 years now, not to age you, but it's a long time. Have you ever seen a period where there could be a political appetite, including now, where entitlement reform could realistically happen in any significant way?
Yeah, we'd have done entitlement reform this year if we hadn't lost that Senate seat in Alabama, and if McCain wasn't sick. I mean, we were ready to move on entitlement reform on many of the entitlements, all the welfare programs, this year. The plan was to do tax reform last year and entitlement reform this year. When you only had a one vote margin, and with McCain not able to really travel, a no vote margin, it was too much. But we will strengthen in the Senate this election cycle.
It looks that way.
The question is, if we hold the House, then next year we do entitlement reform. That's why I was surprised when Speaker Ryan stepped down, or didn't step down, he just said, I'm not going to run again. Because he really wants to make that happen. Now, he's already sold that to the House Republicans. The Senate's bought into it. So I think it happens, and he can be on the outside helping to make it happen as much as he was on the inside.
I want to talk about the Congress because you tweeted something which I thought was extremely relevant and profound. I'm going to read it here. It said, you said this is not a do-nothing Congress, but there's 500, can't even read my writing, 69 House-passed bills awaiting for Senate action. Manchin, Donnelly, Heitkamp, McCaskill, Tester, and Nelson. What are we looking at here? Is this
569 bills that in the last year and a half, this Congress, Congress's last 2 years, have passed the House, and many of these with massive votes from Democrats too. And the Senate has decided that we don't like Trump, and we've been telling everybody Trump doesn't want to do anything good. Well, if the Senate passes one of these House bills, or 50 of them, or 100 of them, or 300 of them, let's say most of them are conservative and the Democrats in the Senate don't want to do anything that way. There are 100, 200 that are just plain old reasonable reform stuff that aren't ideological things that the left would have a problem with. There's stuff that gets 400 votes in the House. That's a lot of Democrats voting for something. Right to try, passed overwhelmingly in the House. The Senate has a policy of not passing anything so the president can't sign anything so they can claim he's not getting anything done. And that is the strategy they have. They tried it under Harry Reid as well, running against the Do Nothing Congress when they were the guys in charge of not letting things happen. The problem with that is we get back, I think it's possible the Republicans finally get rid of the rule, it's not a law, the rule that allows you to filibuster and require 60 votes. So if you could pass laws with 51 votes, the way you can get a Supreme Court justice or a nomination to be Secretary of Defense, those used to take 60 votes too. Now it takes 51. If you do that, those 569 laws all pass. That's a very significant change in the way the world works, all for the better.
What's stopping, obviously obstructionism, it's a political calculation under Chuck Schumer, and they're following exactly what you saw with Harry Reid, understood. But what is stopping those senators that you mentioned in your tweet who are up for re-election this year? We see that with the Supreme Court pick, right? I mean, there's a lot of questions about those particular senators. Do some of them come over to the right?
No Democrat senator in the last couple of years has cast a vote for anything moderate or conservative that was the deciding vote. If the Republicans already have 52 votes for a nominee, for a law, sometimes some of the Democrats in red states. None of those Democrats in red states are moderates. None of them are conservatives or moderates. They're all liberals. But they're in West Virginia, and they're in Indiana, and they're in North Dakota, and they're in Montana, they're in Missouri. Their constituents don't like the way they think, and so they have to pretend to be moderate, so they announce they're moderate, and every once in a while they'll throw a vote for something that Trump supported. But again, only if the votes were already there to pass it, or the votes were not there to pass it, right? Let's say it's going to lose for sure by 5 votes. One of them might vote with the president. They have to get permission from Schumer or before him Reid.
So if Schumer knows they're going to lose it, then go ahead and save your seat.
That's right. That's right. But they will never be. So
Dick Durbin said you put party before individuals now. He said this yesterday or a couple of days ago.
Yep.
That's their line right now.
Yes. And so they're telling them you get no ability to step outside this.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I think frankly the Supreme Court is such an emotional thing for the left because they can't move the country to the left through Congress or the presidency. They can't elect anybody in left wing. But they do want the court to keep pushing the country to the left. Unfortunately, what's happening is the country had been pushed dramatically to the left on things like forced union dues for government workers.
Yeah.
The court said, yeah,
just overturn.
You can, yes, and so when people talk about the court moving to the right, what it's really done is swinging back from this bizarre position that you should be required to pay dues to somebody to keep a job. Where does that come? Where's that in the Constitution? How is that acceptable in the United States of America? It's not.
Yeah.
Only the courts allowed it to be seen as acceptable. And as that gets undone, many of the left's victories are not victories they won at the ballot box, are not victories in the battle of ideas. They didn't win it through rhetoric or reason or a good argument or example. They won it because the court said, we say this is non-negotiable. And when the court says, we're not going to say it's non-negotiable, it's now up to states to decide, it's up to the federal government to decide. Those are the things that will really make a difference. And the left sees itself losing ground.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about broader economy. You were a huge advocate for the tax cuts.
Yep.
When we spoke earlier, you said earlier this year, you said they probably may not go far enough, but I'm very, very happy. And what are we looking at right now? I don't think it's being reported from a lay economist viewpoint. We're not seeing how it's impacting. What are you seeing right now, especially the small business community?
Sure. There's several ways to measure it. You saw the one that 600 companies have done bonuses or pay increases or other things like that. That's kind of cool. Add to that 100 million households, small businesses and households, have seen their utility bills go down. Well, why? Because every time Obama or Clinton raised taxes on businesses, that includes utilities. And so your utility bill went up because Pepco simply takes the tax, adds it to your bill and sends it to you, and then you get mad at Pepco. But it was Bill Clinton or Obama that raised your taxes. Well, when President Trump and the Republicans reduced corporate taxes, dollar for dollar, that flows through to consumers because it's a regulated monopoly. The government says taxes, you add it, tax cuts, you withdraw it, you reduce it, and so billions of dollars in lower utility bills.
Okay.
Stock market's up by about a third from where it was before, so your 401k,
right.
your IRA, your life savings are all up. 90% of Americans have more take-home pay today than they did 7 months ago. Less money's taken out of your paycheck, and you get to keep it, and that's now into eternity. So all of those things add to that. We've created significant new job creation, about 3 million jobs. And we're starting to see many, many more people come into the workforce who didn't think there was a job available for them and now believe there is. And so actually the unemployment number went up last month.
Yes.
The reason is we created 200,000 jobs and 600,000 people said, we see jobs, and they jumped in, and all of a sudden they're part of the workforce, whereas 2 months ago they weren't. So that's a good sign. Unemployment number should go up during a recovery.
Right.
Not down at first.
And explain that. Explain how the worker participation index works, because there's a lot of confusion, especially in the media.
Yes.
Right?
Labor force participation is what percentage of people between 25 and 55 are at work. Okay? And it's about 60 something. During the Obama years, that went down. During recoveries, it's supposed to go up. A larger percentage of the available workforce is at work.
Right.
Obama reduced unemployment not by bringing additional people into work, but by getting about 3 or 4% of the population to quit looking.
Okay.
That was the drop in the unemployment
right.
number. With Trump, you're seeing people come into the labor force and getting jobs. And that's what's reducing the unemployment number, and U6, which is the real unemployment
right.
number. People who have a job compared with people who would like a job, not just people who are looking.
Why do you think everybody uses U3 as a standard?
They shouldn't. U6 is the relevant number.
Right.
The broader
There's 3,
number.
right? There's 3, 6, and 12.
Yes.
Right? The 6 seems so much more reliable, but why is it now this is what the unemployment number is?
Because that's what they did for so long, and they then can compare this month to last month, plus all during the 8 years of Obama, U6 was such a bad number. U6 reminded you that the number of people who would like to have a full-time job and didn't,
right.
so they either have a part-time job, or they quit looking, or they can't find a job, you add those together, it was still around 8%.
Yeah, it was.
That's a lousy number.
Yeah, it was, and I understand that from a political standpoint, but I'm always just wondering from a metric standpoint. Now, you're focusing on the economy, you're saying that the tax cuts have kind of trickled through the economy, trickled down, I know people hate that term, but that's essentially what you're talking about here. NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, they have a consumer optimism index, or a small business optimism index. It is now at the highest level, I think, in recorded history for the NFIB. What are small business owners, and I'm an entrepreneur, I'm an advocate for small business owners, this is what I have as a career for 25 years. What are small business owners now looking at as far as the landscape?
Sure, a couple things. If you buy a car or a truck or a new building or new machinery or new computers, you get to expense that as opposed to depreciate it over 5, 10, 20 years.
Okay.
So it reduces the cost of all new investment. Then when you earn $1, instead of having the government take 35% of that dollar, it takes 21% of that dollar. So the cost of investing in something to create new jobs or to make present workers more productive is lowered because you expense it rather than depreciate over time. And the time value of money, you'd rather have $1 today than 5 years from now.
Right.
And then the payout, your profits, are up because the government takes less of your earnings. So at both ends, it's less expensive to invest in things that create jobs or make workers more efficient, effective, and you get a better payout at the end with money that you earn. At both ends, it encourages more investment because there's much more to be reaped. Also, 28 million small businesses are pass-throughs, partnerships, sole proprietorships, subchapter S corporations. They don't pay corporate income taxes. they pay the personal income tax rate of the owner or owners. And that can be as high under Obama as 44%. So while corporate was 35, and that was very high, higher than China and Germany and the people we compete with, the small businesses were hit by 44%. Well, we took all the individual rates down somewhat, including the 39.5 rate down to 37. And then we said, if you're a small business person and the income is business income really instead of individual wage income, we take another 20% off. So we reduce the rate further. So every time we do tax reform in the past, we said so much for companies, so much for individuals. Now we're going to do so much for corporations, so much for small businesses, so much for individuals. There'll be 3 buckets that you're always looking at. And small business will always be one of the winners. Whereas in the past, the Democrats would look at a small business and say, that's a rich person. I said, no, it's like 7 people. It's a business, it's a pizzeria, it's a dry cleaning store, it's not a person. No, it files as an individual. So they taxed it like it was a football player instead of a collection of individuals. So by dividing it into 3, we can much more easily force down the business taxes on the 28 million small businesses that hire about 75 million people in the United States.
I'm deeply concerned about how people are learning about this, because what is presented is as if it's us and them and the corporate greedy, you know, and this, we saw this recent primary in New York where you have a socialist, you know, and you seem to have this movement across the country, and it isn't just the United States, it's also very deeply ensconced in Western Europe as well. It's not new, you've always had left and right, but what are we teaching our children nowadays about this? Is economics just no longer discussed?
The good answer is a lot of people have a certain amount of common sense, and when you get older, more common sense kicks in. It's easy for 20-year-olds in college who've been given everything all their lives to believe that money is free and life is free, and if you want something, you should just wish and ask Tinkerbell for it, or the government, or your parents.
Right.
And at some point, your parents quit giving you stuff for free, and hopefully you don't get trapped into government dependence, although some people do, and that's not healthy for them. So there is a challenge, I guess, in an expanding economy with more opportunities. 1 million people drive Uber, and Lyft is additional number as well. People do Airbnb. The number of self-employed people who, they may have a regular job, you know, 9 to 5 somewhere, but then they also do Uber or Airbnb or Lyft or something in the gig economy, the sharing economy, where they're the boss, where they're in charge of their time and so on. So about 10 to 11% of the population is doing that now, and that's a new project line. That's a new freedom that people have.
Okay. Another question for you relating back to the Supreme Court. Everybody on the left is screaming their heads off about some of the decisions that were just passed, especially in relation to the union. But there was a bill, or I should say that there was a case that was decided for allowing small business owners to be charged sales tax no matter what state they're in if they sell online. How do you think that will impact small businesses?
I think it was a very bad decision. I understand their argument that they shouldn't be making the rules. Congress should, but we did have a rule that made sense, which was the state can only tax businesses inside the state. Alabama can't tax businesses in Maine or Oregon. They can only tax businesses with skin in the game in Alabama.
Yeah.
Right now, there are no rules. Congress will come up with some rules that'll be vaguely stupid, but I don't know that you get much better than the rule they had of nexus, physical nexus. If you don't have a physical building, office, people, staff, then that business isn't in Alabama, and Alabama can't tax it. Okay? You can tax consumers in your state, people from Alabama, but you can't tax a business based in Maine or Missouri, because there's too much room for abuse. I mean, it's really taxation without representation. They opened up a Pandora's box and they said, well, there are no rules right now, and 50 states will come up with unhelpful things, and then there'll be a panic, and then they'll try and come up with some compromise about what do you do to keep abuses from happening. They had a perfectly fine rule before. Some people on the Supreme Court said, no, the Supreme Court shouldn't be making rules like this. Congress should. I understand that. It's not actually a bad idea. But it's going to be miserable while we bounce around and try and work it out. Because we went from a okay rule to no rules at all.
Yeah.
No limits on state and local power. Okay. No limits on what they can do to loot small businesses, large businesses in other states. I do worry that smaller companies wanting to sell on the internet will effectively be denied the ability to compete competently on that because it's so there are 12,000 different taxing districts, 12,000 in the United States.
That's incredible.
You going to be able to remember that? I can't.
So a lot of people will argue on the other side saying, well, that's not fair to the brick and mortar stores, though.
I've heard that argument. I served on the commission on thinking through how you tax the internet back in 97, 98. And we looked at the numbers, and the numbers on how much money the states were losing was ridiculous. It's the same number they gave the Supreme Court 20 years later. It's a made-up number.
Okay.
And now that Amazon, which is the biggest player, is in all 50 states and is paying taxes in all of the states, the amount of money that states are losing is close to zero. I mean, it just isn't a real significant number. Sales tax revenue has been going up all through this period, so the idea that sales tax revenue is collapsing is nonsense. Yeah. And think about it in terms of fairness. If you want to buy $100 worth of books in Utah, 6% sales tax, you go to the store there, you pay $106. Okay? You want to buy it from somebody who has a used bookstore in another state online, you have to pay the $100 plus the transportation fee to bring the books in. There are very few products, diamonds perhaps, very expensive photographic material, cameras and so on, where the expensive shipping is less than the tax. So it's not really unfair competition. It is competition on, well, I can do it at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't have to get in a car and drive to a store. I like being able to do it in my room. The competition is on ease of purchase, not cost.
Gotcha. Okay. Last question, and I want to get back to trade again because it's such a huge issue for us right now. As we're speaking today, and people are going to see this at a later date, but President Trump is in Europe. He's talking with NATO, and he's trying to get everybody to pay their fair share, and so on. I'm reminded when I was in the 80s, I was in high school and college. So when President Reagan, I know you were deeply ensconced in DC at the time, but I remember the media their heads blew up about his approach to Europe. And they said, he's being rude to them and he's demanding things. We're seeing the same thing today with Donald Trump.
Yeah. It is almost word for word the conversation that Trump and Reagan are having with Europe on NATO spending enough money on defense. Yeah. We're spending like 4% of GDP, they're spending 2%, rough numbers.
Right.
And we spend an awful lot of money defending them, okay? They don't defend us, we defend them. Now, they defend themselves. We'd rather them not be eaten by the Russians or the Soviets, that's true, we would prefer not. But it's not like somebody's attacking us and they're gonna help us. They are getting protected by us, and we pay the bill. And Reagan said, guys, you got to spend more money, you got to take this seriously. The Dutch allowed people to be unionized, and they weren't they weren't running a military that was going to scare anybody or keep the Russians away. In addition, Reagan didn't want the Europeans to pay to build pipelines into Europe so that the Soviets then could make billions of dollars selling them oil and natural gas, and threatened to cut them off in the winter unless they did X, Y, or Z. Yeah. And the Germans and the Europeans were funding that. And the Germans want a Nord Stream 2, a northern stream that goes around Ukraine. So rather than letting the Ukraine say to the Russians, if you're going to sell stuff through us, you can't be messing with us because your pipeline runs through our country. The Germans want to do this other one to cut Ukraine out and make themselves more dependent on Russia. So that was what the president said when he said the Germans are going to be pushed around by the Russians. It's true. He wasn't insulting them. They're putting themselves in a position where they could be extorted, blackmailed, and how can we help them with that? They're shutting down the nuclear plants, they're shutting down the coal plants. They thought they were going to do it with windmills, and they figured out that's not happening. They need natural gas, they need oil. the Soviets have been active promoting groups to stop serious energy being created. That's why there isn't a lot of fracking in Europe. There are political movements against it, funded by the Russians. So when they attack Trump for being mean to the Russians, it's exactly what Reagan did when they say he's being mean to the Europeans. It is the same disappointment in Europe, not taking their national defense seriously, thinking that we'll always bail them out, which they think we will. And Reagan was right and Trump was right, and the fact that the Europeans whine like this is really disingenuous. What's a real lie is when CNN and some of the other guys act as if...
Well, it's also some American quote-unquote conservatives as well. I say quote-unquote because you have to divvy them up these days.
I did see Bill Kristol say that how awful it is. And I tweeted on that. I said, Bill, he said, I've never seen a president act like this. I said, if you were paying attention, you would have seen Reagan do this almost verbatim, what Trump is doing. And it's really disappointing when somebody, I mean, Bill Kristol knows enough about national defense.
Yeah, he's a smart guy.
To know that what he said was just not honest or truthful. And that Trump is having the same problem with the Europeans that Reagan did, and they're both fighting against the Russians and the Soviets, and it's the Europeans that are being disappointing, not Trump. And it's, I guess sometimes if you've just decided you don't like Trump and everything Trump does is an argument to be mad at him, that's not a very grown-up position, but it is the position that some Republicans have taken. Basically, every Republican who feels that nobody in the Trump White House listens to them, they're the never-Trumpers. What it really is, they don't want to be part of a party that they don't run.
They're out in the cold.
Yes.
And it's an ego thing, from my perspective.
No, it's pretty obvious exactly what it is. And if you look at it, people who work with the Trump administration, the Right to Life people work with Trump very well. The Second Amendment people work with Trump very well. Taxpayer group work with Trump very well. It's individuals who have their own theory, and they used to go into the Bush administration and say, hey, let's invade Iraq, and Bush would say, okay. And they were running things. And they decided, could we make Iran a world power by knocking out Iraq? And they did. So a lot of people who gave very bad advice to Bush are concerned that nobody listens to them anymore. Well, it's their own damn fault for giving people bad advice. And if they think they have something to say to the administration, they should say it. Nobody invites you to come to the White House or talk to people. It takes a lot of time to figure out who do you talk to in a White House, the House, the Senate, to move an idea forward. If you're not willing to do any work to do that, well, then you just whine.
Most economists are very pleased with what we've seen as far as the actual achievements by this administration, and that's how you rate a business. Is it successful? Peter Drucker, okay? Do you expect another, there's rumors out there, I'm sure you've heard them, maybe you've even spoken about it. Is there another tax cut coming?
Yeah, there are two. One, I believe that next month, by executive order, they will index the basis of capital gains so that when you pay capital gains taxes, you'll not pay it on the inflation part of the gain, only the real gain. That drops capital gains about in half for companies and individuals. Okay. Big change. That can be done by regulatory change. Just say cost is now cost plus inflation, as opposed to historic cost. Supreme Court has ruled that that's perfectly acceptable in 2002. So I think you'll see that in the next month or so. That will increase the value of all stock, all land, all buildings, all houses in the United States, because they now become a hedge against inflation.
Is that retro, or
oh yes,
Really?
Yes.
So just in time for the 18 elections.
Yeah, I think it will cinch the elections for the Republicans, because the growth and the wealth increase for millions of Americans. Anybody who's in the stock market will see tremendous increase in value. Anybody with a home, anyone with land, yes, it's a big deal. Then there's also going to be a tax cut that we'll vote on this summer, making the tax cuts permanent, the parts that were temporary. The Ds will vote against it. Just remind everybody that they're bad on taxes. But then add to that, if we hold the House and the Senate, I think the Senate will strengthen, the House, we'll see, but if we get the tax cut I'm looking at on cap gains, I think we will hold the House. Then next year we do two things. We do another tax bill and make a lot of the tax cuts permanent. We do need to fix how we tax people who live overseas. About 5 million people are double taxed. We solved it for companies. We didn't solve it for people. Okay. Because you get taxed by France and the United States if you're an individual. If you're a company, France taxes you, the United States doesn't. Done. That's the new rule. But for people, you still get hit by both. That's not good.
Okay.
We can fix that. And then we'll try and make it permanent. We'll also be doing entitlement reform on all the welfare programs, and that will save trillions.
And that will be an incredibly huge fight. Massive fight. Every fight's a fight. Everything is just
every Republican will vote for it.
Right?
Every Democrat will vote against it.
Yeah. But you with the strengthening numbers of Republicans in the Senate, that might not be such a bad deal. Grover Norquist, where can people find you and your methods of tax reform?
Website where we have all our material is atr.org. atr.org. I tweet at Grover Norquist.
Yep.
And between the tweets and our website, we have really all the material we put out.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Freedom Fest. And folks, you can find us on YouTube, Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, Ricochet.com, and everywhere else. Just look for Whiskey Politics. Thanks again to Grover Norquist.
Great name.
Thank you.